Lance o' Meadows, Newfoundland, October 1000. Leif Erikson stood on the rocky shore and looked at the forest that rose behind the beach. Spruce, fir, birch. Trees as tall as ships' masts, straight and thick and endless. He had sailed 3,000 miles from Greenland, following the course that Bjarni Herjolfsson had described 14 years earlier. Bjarni had seen this land, but had not set foot on it. Leif would do more. He would build a home here. His men were already cutting sod from the meadow behind the beach, using spades they had brought from Greenland. The turf came up in blocks, 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, 6 inches thick. The grass roots held the soil together like a woven mat. Each block weighed 20 pounds. The men stacked them in a long rectangle, staggered like bricks, 2 blocks deep. By nightfall, the walls were waist-high. By the following evening, the walls were finished and the roof beams were in place. The men laid birch bark over the rafters, then more turf blocks on top of the bark. The roof was heavy. The walls held it. Leif walked inside the finished hut. The air was cool but not cold. The walls were dry, the roof did not leak. He would live here for the winter. He would explore this land called Vinland. He would build more huts, more shelters, more homes. And when he left, years later, the huts would remain. They would stand for 1,000 years. This is the story of the turf hut, a structure that could be built in hours and would last for decades. The shelter that allowed the Norse to colonize the most hostile landscapes on Earth. Leif Erikson did not invent the turf hut. The technology was ancient when he was born, passed down through generations of Scandinavian farmers who had learned that earth and grass, cut into blocks and stacked into walls, made a shelter that was warm, durable, and nearly free. The Norse called it a torfbær, a turf farm. The Greenlanders called it a torvhus, a turf house. The Icelanders called it a grasatorf, a grass turf. The names changed, but the method was the same. Cut turf, stack turf, add a roof, move in. The whole process took 2 days for a small hut, a week for a longhouse. The structure would last for 20 years with minimal maintenance, 50 years with regular care, and sometimes a century or more if the grass was allowed to grow and the roots were allowed to bind and rebind. The secret of the turf hut was the material itself. Turf is not dirt. Turf is a living mat of grass, roots, and soil that has grown together over years. The roots of the grass spread horizontally just below the surface, forming a mesh that holds the soil in place even when the block is cut and lifted. A good turf block can be carried across a field without crumbling. It can be stacked on top of other blocks without losing its shape. It can be soaked with rain and frozen solid and thawed again, and it will not fall apart. The roots continue to grow after the block is cut. The grass continues to grow on the surface of the wall. A turf hut that is built in the spring will be covered with green grass by summer. The roots will spread from block to block, knitting the wall into a single monolithic structure. The wall becomes stronger as it ages. A new turf hut is solid. A turf hut that has stood for 5 years is reinforced by roots that have grown across every seam. A turf hut that has stood for 50 years is essentially a hill with rooms inside it. The construction of a turf hut began with the selection of the turf. The builder looked for a meadow where the grass was thick and the soil was loamy, not sandy. Sandy soil would not hold together. Clay soil was too heavy and cracked when it dried. Loam, a mixture of sand, silt, and clay, was ideal. The turf was cut in the spring or early summer, when the grass was growing actively and the roots were at their most vigorous. The builder used a turf spade, a specialized tool with a long, flat blade and a footrest on the right side. The spade was pushed into the ground vertically, then tipped back to cut the bottom of the block. The block was lifted free and set aside. A skilled turf cutter could cut 100 blocks in a morning. The turf blocks were stacked immediately or within a day or two. If the blocks were allowed to dry out, they became brittle and would crumble when handled. The ideal block was damp but not wet, firm but not muddy. The builder stacked the blocks with the grass side facing outward. The grass protected the soil from rain and wind. The grass also shed water, which was important in a climate where rain was frequent and snow was deep. A turf wall with the grass side facing inward would soon become a muddy mess because the water that soaked into the wall would have nowhere to go. Grass side outward, and the water ran down the blades of grass and dripped off the bottom of the wall. The walls of a typical Norse turf hut were 2 blocks thick, which gave a wall thickness of roughly 2 feet. In colder climates, like Greenland, the walls were 3 blocks thick, or 2 blocks with a layer of loose turf or moss in between. The double wall created an air gap, which increased the insulation value. The R value of a 2-foot turf wall was roughly R36, which is better than the walls of most modern houses. A 3-foot turf wall with an air gap could achieve R60 or more. The heat loss through a turf wall was negligible. The fire in the hearth did not have to work hard to keep the interior warm. A few sticks of driftwood, a few handfuls of dried sheep dung, and the house would stay at 50 degrees all night, while the outside temperature dropped to 20 below. The roof of the turf hut was a more complex structure than the walls. The Norse builders used a wooden frame to support the weight of the turf. The frame was made of driftwood, which was scarce in Iceland and Greenland, but abundant in Newfoundland. Driftwood logs were collected from the beaches, where they had washed up after floating across the North Atlantic from Siberia or North America. The logs were trimmed and shaped with axes and adzes, then assembled into a frame of rafters and ridge beams. Over the rafters, the builders laid a layer of birch bark. Birch bark is naturally waterproof and rot-resistant. It is also flexible, which allowed it to conform to the shape of the roof. Over the birch bark, the builders laid turf blocks, grass side up. The turf roof was heavy, sometimes weighing several tons, which meant that the wooden frame had to be sturdy. But the weight of the roof also served as ballast, pressing down on the walls and making the entire structure more stable in high winds. The interior of a typical Norse turf hut was small but efficient. The longhouse at Lonso Meadows, the one that Leif Erikson and his men built in the year 1000, was roughly 50 feet long and 20 feet wide. That sounds large, but the interior was divided into several rooms. There was a main hall where the men ate and slept and worked. There was a kitchen with a stone hearth for cooking. There were storage rooms for food and tools. There was a workshop where a smithy had built a forge and was producing iron nails from bog ore. The entire complex housed perhaps 30 people, plus livestock, plus supplies. The turf walls were so thick that the rooms were warm in winter and cool in summer. The roof was so well insulated that the sound of rain was barely audible inside. The floor was packed earth, covered with rushes or hides. The hearth was the heart of the turf hut. It was a shallow pit in the center of the main hall, lined with stones. The fire burned on the stones. The smoke rose to the roof, where a hole allowed it to escape. The smoke hole was covered with a piece of hide or a wooden shutter when the fire was not burning, to keep the heat from escaping. The fire was fed with driftwood, which burned hot and clean, or with dried sheep dung, which burned slowly and produced a steady, low heat. The fire was not allowed to burn all night, because wood was scarce and dung was precious. The fire was built up in the evening, allowed to burn down to coals, and then covered with ash. The coals would glow for hours, radiating heat into the stones of the hearth. The stones would hold that heat and release it slowly through the night. By morning, the hearth would be cold, but the walls would still be warm. The heat from the fire had been absorbed by the turf and was now radiating back into the room. The turf hut was not a permanent structure in the modern sense. It required maintenance. The roof turf had to be replaced every 5 to 10 years because the roots would eventually die and the soil would erode. The wall turf had to be patched where animals had burrowed or rain had washed out the soil. The birch bark under the roof had to be checked for holes and replaced if necessary. But the maintenance was not difficult. A family could replace the roof turf over a single summer weekend. They could patch the walls in a few hours. The structure did not require a carpenter or a mason or any specialized skill. It required a spade, a wheelbarrow, and the willingness to get dirty. The oldest surviving turf huts in Iceland date from the 9th and 10th centuries, the earliest days of Norse settlement. The turf walls of these huts have been excavated and studied by archaeologists. The walls are still intact after more than 1,000 years. The grass roots have turned into a dark, fibrous mass that is almost impossible to break. The soil has hardened into a material that is closer to clay than to earth. The walls have settled, of course. They are not as tall as they once were. The roofs have long since collapsed. But the outline of the walls is still visible. A low mound of earth in the shape of a Norse longhouse. The turf hut has become part of the landscape. It has become a hill. It has become a place where sheep graze and birds nest. But it is still a house. It is still the shape of a home. The Norse turf house tradition did not die out with the Vikings. It continued in Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands for centuries, carried forward not by written manuals, but by habit, memory, and quiet observation. In Iceland, turf houses were the standard dwelling for farmers and their families until the late 19th century. Entire communities grew up in these structures, their lives shaped by the rhythm of seasons and the insulating embrace of earth-built walls. The Icelandic turf house evolved over time, becoming more sophisticated and more comfortable. What began as simple shelters, low, dark, and purely functional, gradually transformed into complex homes with multiple rooms, improved ventilation, and thoughtful layouts that separated living spaces from storage and livestock areas. The later turf houses had wooden interiors, with paneled walls and built-in beds that were often tucked into alcoves for warmth and privacy. Driftwood, scarce but valuable, was used carefully, every plank serving a purpose. The roofs were higher and the windows were larger, allowing more light to penetrate the thick, insulating layers of turf. Glass, when it became available, replaced oiled skins or thin membranes, bringing a new clarity to interior spaces. The walls were still turf, the roofs were still turf, the houses were still warm in winter and cool in summer. The structure breathed with the land, maintaining a steady internal climate even when storms raged outside or frost hardened the soil. Life inside these homes followed a pattern dictated by necessity. The central hearth provided heat and a place to cook, but it also served as the social heart of the home. Families gathered around it not only for warmth, but for storytelling, tool repair, and shared labor. The thick walls muted the howl of the wind, creating a stillness that many modern houses cannot replicate. In a landscape where fuel was scarce and winters were long, the efficiency of turf construction was not a luxury. It was survival. The last family to live in a traditional Icelandic turf house moved out in the 1960s, stepping into a modern world of concrete, electricity, and plumbing. Their new home had conveniences that generations before them could not have imagined. Electric heat, running water, bright artificial lighting. The turf house was demolished, as many were during that era, seen as outdated and tied to a harder past. But the method was not lost. Knowledge rarely disappears completely. It lingers in memory, in old photographs, in the stories of those who remember. Today, a small number of Icelandic families have returned to turf house living, not out of necessity, but by choice. They rebuild these structures using both traditional methods and modern insights, blending old wisdom with new understanding. They say that the constant temperature, the natural humidity, and the quiet are worth the maintenance. In a world filled with noise, artificial climate control, and synthetic materials, the turf house offers something different, something grounded, literal, and symbolic. It reconnects its inhabitants with the land in a way that modern construction often does not. The lesson of the turf hut is the simplest lesson in shelter building. The best building material is the one that is already there. The Norse did not import timber from Norway or stone from Scotland. They used the ground beneath their feet. They cut it, stacked it, and lived in it. This was not merely practicality, it was an understanding of limits and possibilities. Transporting heavy materials across oceans was costly and dangerous. Using local resources was efficient, reliable, and sustainable long before those words became part of modern vocabulary. The turf hut was not a primitive expedient. It was a sophisticated technology, refined over centuries, optimized for the landscape in which it was used. Every cut of turf was deliberate. Each layer was placed to shed water, resist wind, and retain heat. Builders understood how moisture moved through soil, how frost expanded and contracted the ground, how wind would strike a hillside in winter. This knowledge was not theoretical, it was lived. Mistakes were remembered. Successes were repeated. A turf hut in Iceland looked different from a turf hut in Greenland, which looked different from a turf hut in Newfoundland. In Greenland, where conditions were harsher and resources even scarcer, walls might be thicker, roofs lower, designed to resist stronger winds and deeper cold. In Newfoundland, where timber was more available, turf might be combined with wooden framing in different proportions. The material was the same, the method was the same, but the shape, the size, the roof pitch, the wall thickness, all were adjusted to the local conditions. The Norse builders did not have engineering handbooks or computer models. They had experience. They had a tradition. They had the knowledge that if a turf hut worked for their father, it would work for them. But it was not blind repetition. It was adaptive continuity, a willingness to adjust details while preserving principles. That balance between tradition and innovation is what allowed the turf house to endure for so long. In many ways, the turf house represents a philosophy that modern construction is beginning to rediscover. Build with the environment, not against it. Instead of forcing the land to accept a structure, the structure adapts to the land. Instead of relying entirely on external energy, the building itself contributes to comfort and efficiency. The earth becomes insulation. The wind becomes something to deflect rather than fight. The result is not just a house, but a system, one that works because it belongs exactly where it stands. The quiet return of turf houses in modern times is not nostalgia alone. It is recognition. Recognition that older methods, shaped by necessity and refined by generations, still have value. Recognition that sustainability is not a new invention, but an old practice rediscovered. And perhaps most importantly, recognition that sometimes the simplest solutions, cutting the earth beneath your feet and shaping it into shelter, are also the most enduring. The turf huts at Lonso Meadows were excavated in the 1960s by the Norwegian archaeologist Helge Ingstad and his wife, Anne Stein Ingstad. The Ingstads found the outlines of 8 turf houses, along with hundreds of artifacts: iron nails, soapstone lamp fragments, a bronze ring pin, a spindle whorl. The turf walls had collapsed and settled over the centuries, but the stoned foundations were still in place. The shape of the houses was clear. The largest house was 55 feet long and 24 feet wide. It had been divided into several rooms, including a main hall, a kitchen, and a workshop. The workshop contained a forge and a slag heap, evidence that the Norse were smelting iron from bog ore. The Ingstads also found evidence of turf repair. Some of the walls had been patched with new turf blocks laid over the old. The Norse had maintained their huts, replaced the worn sections, kept them standing. They had planned to stay. They had not left because the huts failed. They had left for other reasons. Leif Erikson named this land Vinland, which means wineland, because of the grapes that grew wild along the coast. He wintered at Lons Meadows, then returned to Greenland. He never came back. But his brother Thorvald did. Thorvald came to Vinland with a crew and explored the coast. He was killed by an arrow in a skirmish with the indigenous people, the Skraelings. He was buried at Lons Meadows, somewhere near the turf huts. His grave has never been found. The other Norse settlers left Vinland a few years later. They sailed back to Greenland, back to Iceland, back to Europe. The turf huts stood empty. The grass grew over the roofs. The walls settled. The forest crept back. The huts became mounds. The mounds became hills. The hills became part of the landscape, indistinguishable from the natural terrain. 1,000 years passed. Then the Ingstads came with spades and brushes and patience and uncovered the strangest huts in North America. Built in hours, lasted a millennium. Drop a comment below. What's the strangest shelter you've ever slept in? And if you had to build a home from nothing but the ground beneath your feet, could you do it? Hit that subscribe button for one traditional building technique every week, and hit the like button if this story changed how you think about the dirt in your backyard. Because sometimes the best building material in the world is the one you've been walking on your whole life.